description. Hello, everyone. Good to be here with you this afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk just a little bit about building engaged boards through assessment. So this is some stuff that I've been working on for a while to try and be able to get a handle around. Right, so questions about how boards function, what they do, and what difference they make have been questions that I've been asking for quite a while. So I'm Will Brown. I'm a professor here at the Bush School, also get a chance to serve as the director of the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy. And my research has been asking questions about boards and the way they work. And this is some work that I've been playing around with for quite a while that tries to straddle between being able to ask some interesting research analytic questions for the field, but also be able to provide some practical advice to folks who are working in nonprofit organizations. We can get this to go here. There we go. A bit about the center. I think you guys have, some of those you participated in before, know that we were established in 2017. We've got a nice team of folks that are working with us and to help us to be able to get done what we need to be able to do. Thinking about good education programs, carrying out some research activities, and supporting our nonprofits through our service and our outreach. Our values there reflect some of the things that are important to us about nonprofit organizations, the importance of engaging people in what we do, and our work as in the nonprofit sector, and in particular, how we settle in on boards and governance is particularly important to us. And as you see, we're continuing to expand our portfolio of materials that are available. Master's, graduate level stuff, credit bearing stuff, and then increasing the portfolio around continuing the professional education. If you do got questions as we're going along, feel free to put those in the chat box. I've asked folks to kind of monitor that for us. So we'll have those. I'm hoping we'll also have some time during the presentation to be able to get to those. We should. I shouldn't talk more than probably 25 or 30 minutes, I'm hoping. And Angela is going to join in. I know a little bit. She's used this tool as well in some of the work that she's been doing. So with that, so we're going to try and here's what I'm going to try and do. I want to talk just a little bit about board roles. I want to lay out a model of board performance and where this thing fits in regards to how I think about boards. And that's based on some research that we've been doing and what the field looks like. Talk a little bit about assessment, and then specifically about this particular tool that we've been developing and some initial results that we see. And we can talk to you too about, for those of you who find some value in this, about how to be able to participate. Bottom line is I want to talk to you about board self-assessment, why it's important, what it is that we measures, and how we're going to share some information about our assessment tool. So this is the problem statement, if you will. So boards confront a lot of lack of clarity. If those of you who function with nonprofit boards, recognize this list of things that people kind of frustrations or challenges people have. Lack of clarity about how to make a difference. We've got people on our boards who want to make a difference, who believe in our mission, but are not clear about how do I do that. There oftentimes is some confusion about what's my role in relation to a staff member or the leader of our organization, and how should I think about that. And generally, we tend to think pretty positively about those individuals, and we ask them to do a lot. The executive director's role is all encompassing, and we ask them to do all kinds of things, which includes helping shepherd along the board so that they can function effectively. Sometimes this can lead to frustrations amongst board members and a lack of clarity. Research continues to suggest that upwards of half, if not more, board members are not sure exactly what they're supposed to do or how they're supposed to be able to contribute or what that means. And what that does is, we all know that when we're not sure what we're supposed to do, we disconnect. We become disengaged. We're less likely to become put forward effort, right? If you're not sure, I'm not quite sure, is this a good use of my time? Is this the right way for me to be able to do it? The other things that can happen, right, is people get themselves distracted into the wrong kinds of stuff. So if they don't know what to do, then they start talking about what color the napkins are going to be at the event. And right, and we don't want that. So we're talking about trying to get our boards functioning at a level that's instrumental for our organization. So this is the kind of stuff that we're talking about. We're saying we want our boards to carry out a variety of functions and activities. And there's a lot of expectations on our boards in reference to what they do and how they do it. But it does come down to, I'm going to dare to try I'll try the laser pointer. We talk about it in three different sort of buckets, or at least is a pretty typical way. The literature is pretty extensive in regards to governance or oversight roles, where you oversee with the money, you make sure that there's some basic guidelines in place, such as our mission. You think a little bit about the direction and performance of the organization, and you evaluate the executive. So really oversight, making sure this organization is legitimate, is functioning the way we would expect. We try to shift our boards to make sure that they also are engaged in what are called service roles, which is providing strategic guidance, thinking intellectually about what can our organization do? How do we think about the way we move forward and what's necessary? Boards also play a role in regards to sustainability and resource development. You've heard all that, and the importance of networking. And then a big piece of my work has been advocating that boards also need to think about the processes, as the literature talks a little bit about maintenance functions, right? So we maintain our group. So boards have a responsibility to maintain the group as a team or as a working group, and there's some responsibility in regards to making sure we've got the right people, that we're taking care of ourselves in reference to some trainings when necessary, thinking about how we make decisions, and so that can be an important set of tasks as well. So those are the three things that we're talking about in reference to what boards need to be able to do, and it's part of what's contingent in our in this model. So then the other thing that I want to touch on and talk just a little bit about is this overall model about where we believe that this whole thing fits into. So if board performance is the ability to be able to fulfill some of those functions that I just discussed, those general categories, doing it in a way that's, uses good processes and good decision making and engaging people and doing those kinds of things, building the kinds of relationships both internally and externally, then the board's going to have a positive impact on the organization. The research has demonstrated that pretty consistently. We saw it again in a lot of the research. Exactly how that plays itself out continues to be a little bit problematic in the sense of knowing the exact mechanisms, but we got a good sense that boards that perform well are aligned or are with organizations that are also performing well. And that includes things about being able to have the impact that we want to be able to have, being able to sustain our organizations in the way we need to be able to do it, and having a good reputation. People are thinking positively about who we are and what we want to try and be able to do. So then the question becomes, if boards do make a difference, if we can get boards to do the things that need to get done, and they do have a positive impact on our organizations, what can we do to support our board to be able to help it to be more effective, or to be able to engage and fulfill the responsibilities that are important for us? There's a couple of things that come up in the literature. There's a number of different things that we can do, but pretty consistently the importance of having the right people on our board. So that's why this bullet here in regard to recruitment comes up. So having the right people on our board is pretty important. Providing some degree of training is important so that people can enhance their capabilities. So we talk about board member capabilities, making sure that we've got the right people and we enhance their capabilities. And a big piece of that is providing some degree of assessment. So, perhaps not too surprising, but when BoardSource, the most recent piece coming out of BoardSource, which is the Leading with Intent Index, when they're looking at what seems to be associated with board organizational performance, that's supposed to say, right? So it has to do with composition. We mentioned that, and the importance of having the right people, clarity about roles and responsibilities, and engaging in some degree of self-assessment, because it has value in helping people think through what it is that they're supposed to be doing and providing some degree of feedback to the board, right? So we all know the importance of providing that feedback to people so that they have a degree of understanding. BoardSource, which is in some ways the gold standard for material on how boards function and what they operate on. I've been affiliated with them for years, and so I really recommend them as a good resource. You'll see I have got a link to them later on in the slide to be able to talk about that assessment tool. They recommend assessments every 2 years. Working with a colleague who works with associations, and he's saying, oh, this tool, which is slightly different, which is a bit more focused in on the board members and their personal level of engagement, says, oh, that would be a nice alternating thing. He sees the role of the board source assessment one year and this engagement tool as another assessment tool. Let's see. So what is it that we assess in this tool? What are the things that we're looking at? How do we think about the things that are assessed? And then I'm going to share some of the results in reference to what we have in some of these areas. So we asked some basic questions around board effectiveness, basically those functions in those areas. We asked the board members themselves about how well do you think you're doing in some basic level of showing up, participating. So it's basic responsibility. So this idea here, so this is a performance measure. We have a couple of different performance measures in the survey. We asked them to self-assess themselves. We asked the executive to provide a grade of them. We asked the executive to give us some sense of how well they're doing. We also ask a little bit about personal level of engagement, and then we ask about fulfillment of board roles and roles functions. So that's a little bit of this. How confident are you in your ability to fulfill the roles and responsibilities of a board member? How much are you doing that? So it's two sets of questions. And then the focus of this assessment, which again is the individual's level of engagement. How much are you engaged? Readiness to participate, present, actively, emotionally, cognitively, and those, and be ready to go, right? So if we're engaged in our work as a board member, we're attending to what needs to get done. The assessment also has a number of antecedents to explain board engagement, as well as some group level assessments around how well we manage the board and how well we think about working with each other. And then there's a few other, okay, so that's the model there. If that's any better, I don't know, but it's an attempt to try and give you a little bit of a map of what we're thinking about. So the key idea that we're thinking about is we're looking for board members to be engaged because we believe, and the initial research is supporting that as well, that engagement leads to individual level participation. So that degree of participation that we saw and that individual level participation contributes to the overall group level participation. So this is a multi-measurement, it's a multi-level measurement tool where we've got a lot of individual measures, which are how does the individual board member understand their responsibilities as a board member? How do they feel about their ability to fulfill those? Do they align with the values of this organization, and do they trust and do they feel like this is a safe place to fully participate? And again, so that's some of those group dynamic elements. So those four factors contribute to the propensity of board members to be engaged in the work that they're doing. The fact that they're engaged contributes to their fulfillment of roles and responsibilities. And then they basically function within a group, right? So we function with the way that we handle the meetings, the way that we structure our discussions, and then we also function within the way that we interact as board members with each other. So the assessment tool gets into that as well. And it's at that level, then we believe that if you get engaged individuals with good board processes and functions and good group dynamics, you're going to get a high performing board. Hope that doesn't sound too complicated in reference to a model, but that's the thinking that's going into this tool. There are a few additional questions in the assessment tool around training and preparation. You saw the importance of that, as well as some recruitment and selection. Again, recognizing the importance of composition on boards and how important that is. So one more time, just to clarify that we see this as a pretty fundamental question, that cognitive, affective, and psychological energy is engagement, and that it reveals itself in the actual participation of board members and the behavior of board members to fulfill the things that are responsible. And this goes back to, right, when we talk to people who are working with their board and saying, I just need them to be more engaged. I just need them to be more present. I need them to be more active in what's going on, right? And so that they are there to participate and fulfill. So this is what this assessment is trying to do. It's trying to get at the individual and the extent to which they align with the organization to fulfill their responsibilities. We know that engagement can go in the wrong direction, which is also the other reason that we want to make sure that our board understands what they are supposed to do, right? Because sometimes I'll say to people, you want an engaged board, right? And I think a few executives might reflect on that a little bit and really think to themselves, do I really want people asking tough questions and engaging, right? And the research says that's good for our organization. The recognition is that can also lead to more conversation and more discussion and more voices at the table and people being committed to what's going on. So it's an ongoing process, just like we would expect in any assessment tool, right? It's a conversation, it's discussion, it's thinking about how our board functions. Another piece of this is a recognition that boards have cycles, right? So why do we assess once and then assess again? Because board members come and go, people come and go, leadership changes, board chairs change, the function of the board in that way changes. And so we start to begin to think about how is it that we can continue to keep our functioning. And it's really this process of ongoing development, and assessment fits into that. And this aspect of assessment is one as well. So I've got initial results. If you guys are curious to hear a little bit about what the assessment tool does, what we see, what it says, I'll be able to talk about this both in relation to that model, in relation to what are we seeing in reference to the prevalence of those measures in an initial sample. So it's not a huge group, but we've got about 145 or so, I believe, is about right, of local. At this point, it's a sample of about 150 individuals, 30 organizations, about 120 board members. These folks are from the Brazos Valley, so this is primarily reflective of a relatively local. So this is early on in the utilization of this tool, but we're seeing some very positive results and some very useful information. And Angela can help as well talk about, she's used it, I've used it a couple of times in boards as well. So it's in initial stages. The instrument feels strong. It feels like it has value and is good for facilitating conversations and discussions with board members. So some of the things that we look at include, as we said, board performance, right? So these are some of the questions that we see. We ask board members, this is executives and board members providing their perspective on some of these ideas, asking that very basic question. So this is on a scale of 1 to 5, right? Where 5 is better, more effective. How effective are you at some of these kinds of things, right? And so modestly so or moderately so, right? So we see some strengths here in reference to this question. Working well together, we do well together. We interact. We feel like we're comfortable in that space, right? And then you can see some other areas where you might say, okay, we're not quite as effective in this area in regards to increasing the diversity of our board, as compared to some of the others. I mean, this one always comes up and is striking to me a little bit too, that we're seeing people saying, oh, we're not all that effective in spending time on strategic issues. So we're not necessarily spending time in ways that is over the overall strategy for our organization. And I recognize organizations are at different points in time and some of what they're doing. So this, like I say, any assessment tool is going to have strengths and weaknesses, but this gives you some insight into overall, how's our board doing? And across some of these basic dimensions, and allows you to be able to have a conversation and say, okay, well, we're strong here, we're weak here. How can we work on that? What should we be able to do? Do we agree with that? To what degree is that informative for us in reference to? So that's that last bullet model on there in reference to the model. And then this is that middle one where it says, oh, I as a board member, I'm active, I'm participating, or I'm engaged in some of the work that's necessary. And so it talks about, to what extent do you do these things, right? So are you actively serving as an ambassador? Are you engaging in recruiting new members and leaders for your organization? You can see all the different elements, right? I challenge assumptions. Right. So you can see the strengths. People are saying, oh, all in all, I contribute to participations and discussions when I got something to say. I attend board meetings more or less. Right. people are coming prepared, sort of, right? And so you can see some of these different measures in reference to the extent to which this is a board members self-assessment about the extent to which they are fulfilling kind of basic board responsibilities. Another area to take a look at is, this one is an interesting set of questions, and there's more of them than this. I just pulled a few of them here so you could take a look at it. There are 2 tiers of questions, as I said. How confident are you to fulfill particular roles or particular functions as a board member, and how much are you actually doing it, right? So you can see the distinction between, oh, I'm fairly confident in being able to engage. Actually, I mean, these measures are not, this is a 4-point scale, so 1 through 4, not the 5-point scale. So you've got people up here saying, oh, we're doing all right. I'm feeling confident, versus, how much am I actually doing this? I'm actually participating and engaging in some of these things. And so this is also a nice area for conversation for boards in reference to, once you've got the results in front of you, you can begin to say, oh, we're seeing some gaps here, right? So we've got people that think that they would be able to do things, but that they're not necessarily engaging in them all that much, not very frequently, right? And so it can be a really good, and there's, like I said, I think there's 8 to 10 of these things maybe that we assess, again, primarily functioning related to some of those board level measures and those board level ideas. A couple more we can go through. I don't want to get too many of these, but I wanted to give you a little bit of sense of what some of those things are and what are we seeing. This is that group dynamic element, right? I talked about this idea, the importance of how the group functions and the importance of the group and making sure that the group is functioning effectively. So I've combined those 2 different bullets on the diagram there, or those 2 different areas, and just to give you some sense of the kinds of questions that we evaluate, some of which are a bit more structural, how are committees evaluated, right? And some of which are a bit more process or group dynamic elements, frank and open exchanges of ideas, right, is something that people are saying, yeah, we do pretty well at that. But then, so you've got a mix between structure aspects. Do you use a variety of formats in your meetings? Do you, are you spending your time well in regards to what's going on? So these are attitudes that people have about how well the group is functioning and using of its time, and how well people sort of get along and get together in regards to what's going on. We find those to be pretty important, and another area of conversation. I think. Yeah, just one more, because this is the or 2 more maybe. This is the engagement scale. So it give you a sense about what we assess in regards to engagement, right? So people self-report back onto their level of engagement. Basically, I focus a great deal of energy. I'm positive about what I'm doing. I'm enthusiastic. So you can get the sense people generally tend to report themselves as exerting some degree of engagement. And then these are the precursors. So I worked my way over from the right-hand side all the way over back to the other side, back to the antecedents on that diagram, just to kind of give you a sense of some of those measures. And these are the precursor incidences, right? The extent to which my sense of safety, I feel like I belong here, my sense that I have an influence on being able to contribute and make a difference in what's going on, my sense of clarity around what my role is, and the sense that I'm attached or I'm aligned with the mission and purposes of this organization. So we've got those 4 different concepts on the end, which contribute to engagement, et cetera. So I think I'm going to show you so the next slide then reminds us, okay, so that was the diagram that this model, this assessment tool is built around. And then we did some initial statistical modeling to try and be able to basically test, do those arrows really Is it all theoretical, or is it real, or is it at least demonstrated in reference to some empirical work? And some of the initial empirical work is suggesting, yeah, these are reasonable theoretically, conceptually, we know they're reasonable to see these arrows in place, and the data in this assessment tool is suggesting that that's true. So we see that the antecedents, especially around ability, task ownership, and trust, are related to that idea of engagement. We also see that engagement does explain the tendency of people to assess themselves in regards to that performance measure. So you saw all of those questions. We also see that engagement, and then one of those antecedent variables, explains the amount of time that people spend. So specifically asking them roughly, how much time did you put into serving the board last year? And people make an estimate and give a judgment about how much time did I spend in that. We also see that engagement explains the amount of money that people gave to the organization. So the two are related in this sense that, so when you put all these things in, I didn't throw the whole regression model up there for you, but we have that that says when you account for all these things, what explains that dependent variable of performance? We're seeing that engagement is quite a pretty robust predictor, if you will. More data is needed, but we're going to continue to sort of unpack that, and I feel really positive about that's going. And when we sort of move up, if you will, on levels of analysis, so not just my individual time, not just the amount of money that I give, and not just my sense to show up at meetings and participate in discussions, but actually to participate in those governance roles, right? So governance roles tend to be functioned at it's not just one individual, it tends to be people functioning together. And so at that point, we see that the group dynamic variable jumps into the analysis and starts to say, okay, it's not only just engagement, it's also this idea of group dynamics and the way that the group is working together to facilitate an individual's participation in their governance tasks. And then we look one more time at that very last variable where we ask board executives to assign a grade to their board members, A, B, C, or D, right? So we are academics, so we can't help ourselves, and it's grading season here at A&M. And so we've asked our executives to do that as well. And so we see some of these other antecedents providing some degree of explanation here in regards to the performance. So you get the sense of the assessment tool. It's got a variety of concepts that we're trying to be able to explore around behavior or reported behavior of board members and the propensity of those board members to be able to fulfill those responsibilities. So the assessment, I'm going to shift just a little bit. If there are conceptual questions or anything, did you guys see anything that's worth pausing for a second? And maybe before I get into this part of it, go back to just kind of the diagram and pause for a second about the measurements, about what we saw, thoughts about its use. Angela, you know what, maybe this is, if you're up for it, riff a little bit about how you've used some of these results, right? So you've looked at these reports that get generated, you've used them in conversations and discussions. Do you mind?
Sure. You know, I found this to be a really helpful tool in getting the executive directors and the boards to connect with one another. In a couple of different situations that I've used it in, the ED had a different perception about how well the board understood their roles and responsibilities and what they should be doing. So this was an effective way to start that conversation without it being threatening, without, sort of eliminating the finger pointing between the board members who feel bored and as the ED know what they're doing, and the ED who's frustrated saying my board members aren't here to support me. So to be able to have this data, the way I've structured it is I'll talk with the executive director first, and then when we go into the full board meeting, if we're doing a half-day planning or something like that with them, or a full day strategic planning session, we start with this beginning to say, here's the foundation, because you guys are so important to the organization. We really need to know, if we talk about doing organizational assessments, we look at how we're performing in, finance, and even with our facilities management and our human capital. So why shouldn't we take time to really think about how the board's working? And at that moment, I pause and quite a few little light bulbs start going off. And then we can share this data. So it's not just general data, it's their own, data and how they feel about their own board. And I found it to spur some really good conversations. Certainly, after the EDs realize that, the board doesn't necessarily understand their roles as well, we usually end up tweaking a bit of the presentation and having a little more training as part of it. But it's just enlightening for them. As far as the composition, I like to look at sort of their functional expertise to see if anybody's overbalanced there, because what I've seen is that even though boards tend to be confident in most of the skills, like the slide that you have up here, Will, in general, they're confident. The areas they're least confident in tend to fall under finance and legal. That's been consistent with the ones that I've talked with. So it's nice for me to see, who do we have on the board? Are there areas of expertise that we should be talking about to bring different voices and perspectives to the board? The other thing is, I like to make sure at this point we talk about it's a succession planning conversation that's sort of veiled in a sense. That sometimes people get nervous when they hear succession planning. But when I say, look at how many you've been on the board, how many have been here for 3 years or more, most of you have served as an officer. So how are we going to get some new ideas here? And then the boards that I've used this with have both been two of them in particular, because they ended up with almost identical number of hours served, which was why I remembered those examples. They were surprised by how few hours that they'd actually spent in their board service. It's like they overestimate the amount of time that they're putting on the board. So those are some of the primary areas. When I use the attitudes toward board service element of the survey, what I'm looking for there is, any data that suggests opportunities for growth. For example, if a board says that they've got 58% of, satisfaction, like, not quite 60% of them are extremely satisfied with how the board's operating. So, we walk through and we can show the confidence and the participation levels, and show their own raw data to them, and then to be able to come back and say, now, what do we do to get that number to 85%? That's going to be what we talk about today. So that's how I've used it and how I found it to be really effective in generating open, candid, thoughtful discussion about how they can improve the effectiveness. And there've been some conversations about accountability too, with board members saying, well, telling the ED, well, you need to tell us if we're not supporting you, So that's been fun too, to see where the ownership kind of naturally lies, because I feel like the executive directors, we have to lead from behind in the nonprofit space most of the time. And they carry a lot of responsibility for sort of leading the board without leading the board. And so these conversations I've found to really, that the board embraces it and they kind of hold themselves accountable.
Stuart's asking a question in regards to sort of feeding in here, and what are the conditions? Stuart Mendel is asking, what are the conditions? Stuart's a good colleague, currently at the National Nonprofit Enterprise Institute, or some version of that. Sorry, Stuart, I mumbled up your exact affiliation, and also with Cleveland State has been there as well, and served as in several leadership roles within with our association. Under what conditions on the outset to think about how do you achieve effectiveness? He recognizes composition and those kinds of things, but also thinking about sort of process management might be the other way I would think about what you're asking, Stuart, which is sort of the assessment gets into it a little bit, but and I think the conversation gets into it as well, right? So if you have this assessment tool, you can begin to say, what would be useful for us to be able to get this structured better? One of the things we oftentimes talk about is making sure that we've got time in our meetings to actually have conversations. So you're talking, there's follow-up elements that are done, but there's also things that we do in our meetings to make sure that we've got the time, sufficient time, whether that's thinking about how we handle committee reports, whether that's thinking about how we structure the agenda, how we make sure that people have got the information that they need to be able to actually participate in the discussion. People are showing up engaged and you're not giving them material and information to be able to connect with, then they're going to look for some way to be able to do that. And I think that would be some of the other things that I would start to think about. Open, if you want to chat too, Stuart, you can jump in as well if you want to. Other questions? So I'm gonna go on ahead and go, into what we think so Angela's given you a little bit of a sense of the tool itself and about how she's utilized it in the boardroom, working with people on their boards. The assessment provides a simple and easy to use report, which provides some basic information about all those different measures that we just talked about. It helps you think about the strengths and weaknesses in regards to practices and engagement of board members, and then helps you think a little bit about the processes and what might contribute to performance. So that very specific question about what would we need to do to be able to function better? If we see an area of weakness, then we can figure out what's the right way to be able to do that. Do we need to form a subcommittee? Do we need to be able to do that in some other way? Right. And this leads to some of these other kinds of things that we were talking about: stronger, more effective boards, more engaged board members, trust amongst individuals. So it leads to some of those positive outcomes that we would want to see and happen as a result of some of that assessment. So so this is available if folks want to try and use it. If they want to be able we're charging a modest fee to get ourselves going and to be able to manage Nicole's time and some of Angela's time and my time. But we think it's a pretty good tool. So the customized report is tailored to what you need. Basic demographics of your board members is also provided. You get the detailed reports, and responses are aggregated. We don't give individual responses. Everything's aggregated to the group level, but specific to your organization. Within time, we'll be able to do comparables. We don't have comparables yet sufficiently. Within a couple of years, we anticipate we'll actually have some comparables, so you can say your group did this, everybody else's group is doing that. So you'd be a part of helping us create some of those comparables. And we include some basic information. There's basically two surveys. There's one that the executive director provides more background information on the organization and overall stuff. And then the key here is getting the board members to fill it out. This is the key to getting good information that's viable, that facilitates the kind of conversation that you can sit in the board meeting and say, you all said this, that, or the other thing in regards to this area. Is that important to us, and what do we need to be able to do about it? So that's the important piece and what makes this thing the most useful. Not just listening to one person, but a number of folks in regards to the way they think that their group is functioning and the way that they think they're operating. This is what we're charging and the way we're thinking about that. So there's different levels. The easiest thing is you just call us up or have a conversation and we can discuss it with you about what makes sense. But I do want to also recognize that other people have tools. There are free tools. So the McKinsey one is out there, so you can grab that and you can utilize it. It's a PDF sheet that can be modified and played around with. I really like Carter McNamara's stuff at the Free Management Library. He talks a ton about all of these different pieces about assessment. And so I've given you the link right to his piece, but if you haven't played around on his website, it's a little dated, but there's a lot of material there that's available. The National Center for Nonprofits has some lists, and they actually had some broken links. So I went ahead and put some of those down here as well. So they identified the Maine and the New Hampshire group, so you can get a sense of what they're charging. And then there's that board source self-assessment tool, right? So that's at about $1,000 is what they're charging, just to give you a sense of what some of that looks like. I think I'm getting close to being able to open up again for conversation. So I was hoping folks might be open to wanting to have questions about the way their board engages, the way they've used assessment tools, the way you haven't used assessment tools. What's the tricky part of the assessment? That's I'd love to have that conversation. We've got a couple people on the call here that I know must have some experiences that have worked well, haven't worked well. I'd love to provide a little bit of time for that. So I'll look to you all to suggest. Again, you can do it through the chat box. You can also raise your hand if you want to. We're happy to call on you. Nicole's going to kind of keep track of people there, and Kenny's looking as well, waiting for stuff. Otherwise, I have to call on Dr. Kerr, and then she's probably having her lunch, having tea. Other questions, ideas? I'm curious to hear how many people have used assessment tools and found them useful or less useful.
As people are thinking, I can share the organizations I've worked with, that the board members were very pleasantly surprised with the information when we sat down and spent roughly an hour talking about their own perceptions about where they need to move and move their organization and what they need to focus on. They found it to be a really useful exercise. And you never know when first time you use something like this in a tool, how well received it would be. And they felt it was really worth their time and made them think a little bit, particularly about those disconnects between the board and the ED.
The other thing that we see, right, is that it's a process. Board governance, board development is a process, and that assessment fits into the whole. When you look at all of what's required for boards to do, right, all of those different functions, all of that different kinds of stuff, assessment is just one more thing that it contributes to an executive and to a board's ability to be able to fulfill some of those functions and have those conversations. So it's an ongoing development model, really, and assessment really just fits into that as one point of time that forces a conversation in some ways that Angela is referencing, that forces or sets up a conversation around some of the things that people don't often talk about. Like, how well are we getting along as a group? How well are we having conversation? How satisfied are we with the structure of our meeting? And a lot of times people don't think much about that in regards to as they're going through the work of the board, as they're coming in from something and going out to something else, or planning or preparing for a particular event, to pause for a minute and say, okay, how well are we functioning as a group, and how well are we feeling comfortable that I can contribute in the way I want to be able to contribute? Because it gets down to it, you actually invest a lot of time in your board. In being able to understand that without some kind of assessment can lead you a little bit of a challenge. Vanessa was asking me whether Vanessa mentioned the idea that she's a psych major and asking if as you could tell, my training is in organizational psychology. And so I'm straddled between the two, between practice and theory and conceptual modeling. So my training is indeed in organizational psychology. So you recognized it there, Vanessa. It's true. I admit to the fact that informs a lot of the way I think about the model, that informs a lot about the assessment that we're trying to develop up, and the extent to which we believe it could be useful to organizations to make decisions. Other questions? Are there other ideas? We have time.
Hey, Will, maybe comment on, in this environment where, organizations have been shut down, they're starting to reset a bit. I mean, some of the feedback that I've received locally with you all going out and doing this and interacting with nonprofits is that the timing is ideal based on what organizations have kind of been through the last couple of years. And as they are resetting, getting into, planning sessions, going through, recruitment procedures for new members, just that whole thing. I mean, I've received some pretty good feedback. Maybe if you could comment on that, that might be helpful for the audience as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? So we've all come out of these Zoom meetings. We've seen kind of a crisis that we had our boards were engaging in, oftentimes engaging in ways that were very different than what we were doing prior to the pandemic. And so yeah, a pause and a reflection and a discussion about how I'm feeling about my ability to be able to participate, and what is it that I'm supposed to be participating in now, given the current context. Yeah, would make a lot of sense, right? Because we were sort of in one phase of, oh my God, we've had to completely restructure the way we do our work. We've had to do it in a completely different way. We've had to modify our events. And so there was a lot of work to be done and a lot to be potentially engaged in. And so I think as things start to get back into normal as much as it can be, to pause and remind ourselves, what is it that we're supposed to be doing as a board? What is it that and how are we feeling about that? seems like it would be a very useful exercise as people are coming out of that and going into the next phase of where their organization is trying to accomplish. Angela sees this too in a lot of some of the planning work that's going on. Sometimes when people build this into their planning work. So let's start with our group, with our board and the way that they function, and then build this into some of our planning to make sure that people are on the right page in regards to who they are and how they function. Deborah, what are you thinking?
I'm loving this. And I am thinking of this board assessment. And by the way, my organization is using this board assessment, the organization on whose board I sit. I see this as a gateway activity to wider organizational performance measurement. This is doable, it's understandable, it introduces the notion of, you know what, we can figure some things out. We don't have to wonder about what's going to drive our success. And I think that notion of clarifying right now the goals, the roles, the responsibilities, that's critical to a successful nonprofit. So yeah, this is I see this as a gateway activity.
So we've got Israel. I just saw your question about why. I mean, Dr. Kerr just addressed that a little bit. Why is it that the board would want to assess themselves, right? But we have these groups perform important functions, and the board can indeed get in the way of its ability to be able to function effectively as an organization. So if it's not functioning in the way that it needs to be able to functioning, so it can be detrimental. And then on the positive side is it can actually contribute and it can actually make a difference for the organization and for the executive leading that organization. So providing some feedback to your board can provide some degree of direction for them, so they feel their responsibilities. I mean, in the U.S. context, right? You've got legal responsibilities of your board, and an assessment tool like this can actually be used to help say, no, we're being very careful about what we're doing, and we're thinking carefully about why we're doing it and how we're doing it, and that allows you to be able to say we can function more effectively. Carly, what's your question?
Yes, thank you so much for putting this on. I just found it really valuable, first and foremost. Secondly, I have a question as it relates, and I apologize if you had mentioned this earlier, how you determined what survey questions were listed, and would it behoove a nonprofit to work with its board chair or work with its board at large to determine the evaluation question or the questions that are evaluated, to help with maybe some buy-in and that dreaded board engagement as well? So I'd love to hear your thoughts. And then Deborah, as somebody who is on a board and has taken the survey, maybe some of your thoughts as well.
Yeah, appreciate it, Carly. Yeah, so the actual instrument, the items themselves in the assessment are drawn from as much as I can from existing literature. So the engagement scale, the actual middle of the model, is an existing scale that's utilized. Actually, a fair amount of it, somebody's making a reference to staff as well. It was initially developed for staff engagement, which is a bit more of a researched area, and I modified it thinking about volunteer leaders. Similar to the antecedent measures. So all four of those antecedent areas are areas which have been assessed before. And so I utilized those assessment measures as well to try and be able to suggest. I ultimately had to make some choices, and we had to test some stuff out in regards to what was working and what wasn't working. So each one of the items has been contributed to by the existing literature. As far as the question around whether the board could engage or should engage in that, I think it makes sense. It's also a fair amount of work, as I was playing around and prepping for this and looking again at all the variety of different assessment tools that are out there. And yeah, without too much work, you probably could get a half a dozen in your hand of PDF documents and Word documents that have assessment tools that are assessing different kinds of things. I think if you have a framework that's saying, what are we looking for? You could begin to play around with that. I think it starts to be a lot of work for potentially modest value. That would be my initial reaction, but I'd be curious. And then you potentially are not assessing stuff in a way that's the most robust, which is what we're trying to do. We're getting there. And so I'm not, yeah, it would be a balance of time, right? So yeah, buy-in is one thing. We can give you some sense. Part of what I'm sharing this for is it helps to get people's buy-in. You got to be able to go to the board and say, are we willing to spend, I don't know, Deborah, what does it take? 20 minutes to fill out at the most? Probably not even that. By the time we get it down to the board member, it's not incredibly long. 15 minutes, I think, is the most it takes a board member if they just sit and click and do it quickly, right? Those are good questions. Thank you, Carly. Deborah, she was asking what did, what was, I can't remember. The development of
What
instrument.
was-
Yeah. What was it again,
I
Carly,
think-
that you were asking, Deborah, Dr. Kerr?
Yeah, I was just wondering, as somebody who sits on a board yourself, what you feel the specific engagement or participation, or if there should be, in developing an evaluation tool like this as a board member.
I believe that if a board is not interested in this type of self-assessment, then that's another conversation that needs to be had. I mean, a board has fiduciary responsibilities. And if someone says, yes, I'll sit on your board, and says, I'm not that interested in how we're doing as a board, as an organization, then that becomes a bit problematic in terms of values, I think. The organization is providing services, and those valued services, the board, I think, and our board has to focus on what is going to deliver the most success for our client population. So if that interest is not there, that's worth the conversation, how people see their role and what is their contribution besides writing a check.
Got a question in the chat box asking about whether this kind of assessment tool would work for a large hospital board, in that context. And then there was also a secondary question about the variance between the board members versus the executives. So I'll answer the second one first. The first one, we do see variation. Board members tend to be slightly more optimistic about how effective they are, and perhaps a bit more rosy in their assessment of how well they're doing. Executives tend to be a bit more pessimistic in some of those assessments, or perhaps realistic, depending upon who you're asking. So which one's real is a good judgment as well. In regards to applicability, because it's based upon individual engagement, I would make some case that, yeah, I think that big swaths of the instrument are perfectly valid, right? Because the instruments in regards to the antecedents of engagement, the measure of engagement, are basically individual level assessments that are based upon people's participation in organizations and in teams. So that part of it's solid. I mean, I think some looking at the degree to which the performance measures, but even just the basic one about I show up to meetings, I participate in conversations, all those questions are pretty generic and applicable for all groups. The performance measures around the board, to be honest with you, those are basic board functions and questions. So, I mean, I don't mean to make the case that it's applicable for everybody in every circumstance, but I think it does a pretty decent job of getting at some of that kind of stuff. But hospital systems are unique entities, and there could indeed be industry specific information that you would want to have in something like that. And we could probably even talk about whether it's worth, as Carly mentioned, sitting down and saying what additional stuff should be in there to make it more valuable, but that would take a little bit of doing. And there are tools specifically for hospitals as well. But this one's, I do think it's unique. When I went to Board Source and presented this a number of years ago, they were like, oh, this is unique because it's getting at the individual level of the board member and the way they feel about how they participate and the way they feel about how important it is to them as an individual to be a part of this group. And that's what makes it, from my perspective, a modestly unique instrument. and why it potentially adds value in a variety of contexts. Got time for another question if somebody would like.
Say, Will, I think what you just mentioned is also why the board members like assume the accountability
Right.
because of the questions that they recall answering, and they know they're talking about how they felt, and they know that they do 5 hours a year on the board, and they see that the average is 9.2. You know, it really, I think that individual connection is what allows them to own this data and to have conversations about it.
We're also here to chat if folks want to catch us afterwards online in another way. Happy to be able to do that as well. We gave you Nicole's contact. There's Denise's contact, our ever faithful admin there that's helping us keep the center kind of going. Yeah, it was a pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk with you a little bit about some of this, and happy to be able to chat more about it and the way it can be used in your organization. Or my research, if you really wanted to. Paper's coming, by the way.
It's fascinating.